We had to essentially choose between paying for our food and the basic bills and paying a part of the rent.
Razzall and her family had fallen behind on their rent late last year after paying substantial visa fees.
It's a home, it's not a property. For me, it's a home, and that is precious.
But lockdown meant their situation worsened.
My husband is the main earner in the house, and he has a small business, but he has not received any grant or any loans. I feel like there are a lot of people like us who have fallen through the gaps.
A ban on evictions put in place in March is due to expire in England and Wales on Sunday. Razzall, a rep for campaign group London Renters Union, has tried to negotiate a plan with her landlord. But she too is struggling with the worries over eviction and rental debt she advises others on.
It's been really bad for my mental health, for my husband's. There were times when we got these really, really horrible thoughts. I remember my husband saying at one point that, is this life worth living? But we had to protect our children from all this stress.
The government told Newsnight that no tenants had been evicted at the height of the pandemic and that it would take further action to support renters and landlords shortly. Charities estimate that hundreds of thousands of people with little to no savings have fallen behind on rent.
The thing that we're really afraid of right now is an absolute tsunami of homelessness when the evictions ban ends. So the ban has to be extended until Parliament comes back and can pass the legislation. It's pretty minor, but the legislation that is needed in order to protect renters from immediate eviction. So that's the first thing. Then we need to look at the level of debt that people have picked up during the COVID crisis, and the government will need to put some financial measures in place in order to help people.
The government faces competing pressures to keep people in their homes, address rental arrears that may simply have become unsustainable, but to do it in a way that, unlike the current ban, doesn't push the financial burden onto landlords. The National Residential Landlords Association says most tenants are paying rent or have reached deals with landlords, but that the ban stops those who need to from taking action.
I absolutely empathise with people who've been...
Candy's tenants stopped paying rent last October after repeated incidents, she says, of antisocial behaviour. The eviction process was still underway when the ban came into effect.
I took out a loan to cover the mortgage payments and the legal costs. So it's made things very, very tight, to the point where Christmas was effectively cancelled in the household. But it is a huge worry, and I'm not entirely sure how much longer I can keep continuing to pay a mortgage with no rental income coming in.
She's concerned a mortgage holiday would affect her credit rating, and she's frustrated because she believes her tenant could pay but is choosing not to.
I felt, fluctuating emotions really, very angry sometimes, very powerless. And anxious. What I think the government should do is step in and help those people who have genuinely been impacted. But it should be the government that is doing that, not expecting landlords to shoulder this cost.
Scotland has extended its eviction ban. Wales announced a financial package aimed at problem rental debt. The question is how in England the government intends to balance the concerns of tenants and landlords.
Well, joining me now is Heather Wheeler, a former Minister for Housing and Homelessness, and Stephen Doughty, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. And Heather Wheeler, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Housing Secretary said no renter who has lost income due to coronavirus will be forced out of their home. In 3 days' time, what's going to happen to the 227,000 renters who've fallen into arrears during this pandemic?
Well, first and foremost, the legislation is September the 30th. So the June the 23rd is a bit of a misnomer. But secondly, the important thing is that there is a listing at court, and the early people who went into arrears before the COVID, so not affected by COVID, they will come before the courts first. Anybody that's been affected by COVID, that's going to happen much, much later. We've also changed the law that landlords have to give all the information about the situation that the tenant is in. And if the judge feels they need to adjourn the case, they can. And anyway, now it's 3 months' notice, not 2 months' notice. So nobody's going to be out on their ear on September the 30th.
The BMA told us, it is a worrying time. We're coming into winter time. And they told us that the NHS, at a time when they're gearing up for a winter surge in COVID, coupled with a flu surge potentially, if an increase in homelessness is added to that, then they say we've got what they called a mega problem.
Well, that's very interesting, the BMA to wade in on something like this. I can't imagine why they feel they need to. I mean, as it happens, one of the most successful stories from all of the COVID issues that we've been dealing with is the way that 15,000 homeless people have been looked after immediately. And, can I use tonight to say thank you very much to Dame Louise Casey, who headed up the Rough Sleeping Initiative during this process for us. And not only that, but the government has already given local councils over £3 billion to help on the move on accommodation so that there are places for homeless people to go to.
But Dame Louise Casey is stepping down. She's stepping down after just a few months. There's a vacuum at the top, isn't there? She's
done a fantastic job. And
why is she going?
She has personal reasons for that, which I'm not party to. But, she has done a great job. And the point is the money has been allocated by the government to local councils to deal with this move on accommodation so that risks of future homelessness should be front and centre for local councils to deal with. They've got the money to deal with it. And I know that they've got the heart to deal with it.
And Stephen Doughty, what's Labour's position on this? When it comes to evictions, Heather Wheeler seems to be saying people in arrears don't need to worry. They're not going to be evicted. What are you asking for?
Well, that's simply not the case. You talked rightly of a vacuum at the top, and one has to ask, where is the Housing Secretary on this? Where is the plan? We're days away from the 23rd of August. There's nothing from him. There's nothing from the Prime Minister. And yet again, we're seeing incompetence and uncertainty when what the British people need going into the autumn is confidence. And for millions of people renting in the country and those nearly 250,000 that you rightly spoke about who are at risk of eviction because of the rent arrears that have come up during the COVID crisis, not through any fault of their own, but because of the economic pressures and job losses and job income being cut. Many of them are going to be deeply worried going into the weeks ahead, and yet there's no plan from the government. And so we're very clear.
You want an extension to this ban?
Absolutely. The ban on evictions needs to continue until the government can put forward a credible plan.
What about compensation to landlords? Do you want to do that as well?
Let's be clear first. The government has to come forward with a plan. Firstly, on the legislation, it needs to scrap this Section 21 no-fault evictions, which they promised to do. It's been Labour's policy to do that for some time, and yet we haven't seen the legislation. And we need also reforms in terms of the way these court processes work to allow for more discretion. But we also need to see the financial support packages in terms of universal credit and in terms of support with local housing allowance, because the reality is that many people, through no fault of their own, are really struggling to make ends meet. And yet from the government, you don't have any certainty about what's going to happen, and indeed the threat of eviction hanging overhead. Let's not forget this comes on the back of an appalling record of this government over the last 10 years on homelessness, with nearly double the number of children being forced into temporary accommodation over the last 10 years. Sorry
to interrupt, but isn't it the case, as the National Residential Landlords Association told us, that landlords and tenants are actually sorting this out between them? In 95% of cases, they've come to an agreement over rent. So we don't need, do we, an extension to the evictions ban?
Well, where landlords and tenants can come to agreements, that's obviously welcome. But the reality
95% of cases,
Shelter pointed out that there are nearly 250,000 people here at risk of eviction. We've seen 20,000 people made homeless during the pandemic, and many people have got significant arrears, have got significant worries about their job going into the autumn. We've already seen the shocking news on the economy, the decline in the economy compared to other comparable countries, many people struggling to make ends meet, but no plan from this government.
Heather Wheeler.
Stephen is just completely missing the point. I mean, we've strengthened the safety net already, increasing universal credit and working tax credit by £1,000 a year. We've announced nearly £1 billion of support for renters and increasing the generosity of housing benefit and universal credit. So, I mean, he's absolutely missed the point. I mean, there's £3.7 billion that's going to local councils so they can actually build social housing so people will be helped. But
What do you
whole
say
point
to that,
is
Stephen?
that people can make these arrangements between themselves. And, there's no point getting bent out of shape over this. There really isn't.
I think with the greatest respect to Heather, she's grossly out of touch with the reality on the ground. And she's grossly out of touch with many families struggling to make ends on low incomes or having lost a job or indeed two jobs because of the coronavirus pandemic. And I think the contrast needs to be drawn here between, for example, the situation in Wales, where my own Welsh Labour government has taken action to extend the period, has given financial support, and is seeking to ensure that people aren't put out on the streets in the run-up to Christmas. This government has no plan, it's acted incompetently, and there is no confidence going into what is going to be a very worrying time for many families up and down the country.
I mean, Heather Wheeler, isn't that true? Isn't that true that... Sorry to interrupt, but Heather Wheeler, isn't it true that it looks like the government's on the back foot again, perhaps? You know, the Welsh have acted, the Scots are active. The government looks in England like it's not as proactive as other parts of our nation.
We've already protected 12 million jobs across all industries. That's cost 30 billion. Now, furlough is beginning to taper off. People are going back to work. Businesses are recreating themselves, reinventing themselves. And that is the next stage of getting out of this COVID crisis, getting people back to work so that there are the jobs there. There are lots and lots of new jobs being created. And that's what the old jobs might have gone, but there are new jobs being created.
But isn't it strange that the government is willing to pay for us to eat out, to help out, but not help with the very fundamental issue of keeping a roof over people's heads?
But with respect, we've already done that. That's why I've already explained to you about the 3.7 billion that is going into local councils to help them build new houses. So that is doing exactly what it needs to be doing.
Stephen Doughty is shaking his head.
Heather can talk about all the headline figures that she likes. The reality is that 20,000 people have been made homeless during the pandemic. We've got 250,000 people now at the risk of facing eviction. And the record of this Tory government over the last 10 years, with double the number of children now being forced into temporary accommodation than on 10 years ago, I think is shameful. And I think
Stephen, it's so difficult.
But Stephen Doughty, extend is your mantra. But what do you actually solve? I mean, the economy. How long are you saying you need to extend this for?
We need to extend it until the government puts a plan in place. And the fact is, at the moment, we have no plan. There is no financial...
But more and more people are likely to be losing their jobs as the economic downturn really hits.
Indeed.
Are you saying we should keep it for months, years?
That's why they need the support with this situation. We need to see the legislative changes that the government promised. We need Robert Jenrick, to come forward and actually explain what he's going to do. He made those promises. And like in so many areas, whether it's on the exams, whether it's on test, trace and protect, whether it's on housing, the government makes these grand promises and doesn't deliver, and then we find ourselves in crises that they could have acted to prevent. And I think with just days to go until this 23rd of August deadline, to have not even come forward and given any confidence to the millions of people renting across the country and the 250,000 who are facing particular difficulties and pressures, I think is absolutely shameful.